before the break, we had you on and we were asking about this. They're not going to keep pushing this. They're not going to keep fighting it. And let me ask you this question as well. Is there one person that above, look, I understand that getting a Supreme Court nominee across the finish line, which obviously was something that you were the quarterback of multiple times, but all of that flows from the person who's making the nominations that's in the White House. Isn't that right?
There is no question that President Trump's biggest and most consequential accomplishment of his first term was his transformation of the 5-4 left of center court to the 5-4 Clarence Thomas court. And conservatives have been talking about making changes to these liberal laws for decades. It was President Trump who actually delivered. Roe versus Wade, affirmative action, case after case after case. This is President Trump's legacy right now for his first term.
Well, and I think, too, because you have so many of these people, these naysayers, who were conservative in name only, right? Or rhinos, is another term. But I think conservative in name only is actually better because, and it's funny because I've been locked in horns with these National Review guys over the last 3 days, apparently, all over this analysis of the Trump indictment, the Presidential Records Act, that normally, and I'll ask you a question about it in a second, but it's the same exact people who were undercutting Trump every step of the way in 15 and 16. If they had had their way, Hillary Clinton would be there today. She would be there today, and we would have potentially 6-3 rulings in the other direction. What would that be like?
Well, we would lose our God-given rights to speak, to associate, to worship, to protect ourselves. We are not playing with our parents' or grandparents' Democrat Party. These are not liberals who love America. These are leftists who hate America. They are Marxist. And like every Marxist revolution, they play for keeps. They are subversive. And like you said, Jack, they never give up. They keep going. And they will keep going and keep going and keep going. And so what I want to say to conservatives, Republicans, right-thinking Democrats, Trump is going to be our nominee. Alvin Bragg guaranteed that. Jack Smith probably guaranteed that Trump is back in the White House. Why do we want to undermine him and make it more difficult for him to get back in the White House? Do we want President Trump or President Biden replacing conservative Supreme Court justices? And that is the easiest question to answer. And for these people who are trying to take down Trump now, they need to understand the primary is already over.
Well, look, I've got to ask you because full disclosure, I'm drafting off of the Mike Davis legal analysis when it comes to the Presidential Records Act, when it comes to everything else that's going on that got me in this fight with Andy McCarthy of all people. And all I did, by the way, was pull up his old columns from when he was at PJ Media before he was at National Review, not the National Review line, where now it's become this whole human events versus National Review thing, which of course is funny because that's what it's been for 70 years when you think about it. Is he saying that no, it was totally fine for Obama to authorize the release of the Stuxnet intel information through General Cartwright, who later, by the way, was charged with perjury in the investigation, but Obama pardoned him. That was totally fine, even though he didn't follow any formal process. And I pointed out that, well, it's very different from the things that you and National Review are saying today. He writes a 5,000-word column responding to me last night in a very strange manner, making all sorts of claims that I didn't make. When I point out some of his false claims, he said, well, I'm sorry, I'm on vacation right now. But I wanted to ask you about a salient point in there, because he said that even under the Presidential Records Act, that President Trump doesn't have the authority to take these because he didn't document the collection of these documents. What's going on there?
Look, I like these guys at National Review. We were allies on the judicial fight confirming Trump's judicial nominees, including 3 justices on the Supreme Court. They just don't like Trump, and they are letting their opposition to Trump cloud their legal judgment. The Presidential Records Act is very clear that any document created or received by the president or his White House staff is a presidential record, and it does not matter whether they are classified agency records or not. They're trying to say that classified agency records sent to the president to advise the president are not presidential records. That is just not the law. They are absolutely dead wrong about that part of the law. And under the Presidential Records Act, the president himself gets to decide whether these are personal records that belong to him. And go look at the Clinton sock drawer case when Clinton had 8 years of highly classified audio recordings, including conversations with foreign leaders and his national security officials that he took from the White House and he put in his sock drawer. And an Obama judge in 2012 said the mere fact that Obama took those White House tapes, it was recorded by the deputy White House chief of staff for operations, took those White House tapes with him when he left, deemed them personal under the Presidential Records Act. He owns them. They're not presidential records. Alternatively, they are presidential records which are owned by the government, but under the Presidential Records Act, the former president can access his presidential records anytime he wants. So can his designated representative. At best, this is a bureaucratic dispute, a civil lawsuit with Biden's librarians and other bureaucrats over presidential records. This is not espionage. Ask these people, Jack, do they want President Trump to die in prison because of an espionage charge because of Trump's fight with Biden's and other bureaucrats? And the answer they will probably tell you is yes, because they fear that Trump's going to win in 2024.
Well, Mike, I think that's exactly right. And I'll just say, without naming names, I've had a lot of people in Washington, D.C. reach out to me and say that's exactly what's going on here. Maybe not specifically with McCarthy, but some of these guys, it's all about keeping Trump from going back into office. It's all about preserving what they view as the integrity of the Department of Justice, the same people that were pushing all of the hoaxes for all these years. Stay tuned. We're going to come right back with Mike Davis, Article 3 Project, here in Human Events on this stupendous and historic day that affirmative action has been destroyed at the university level. Bidenomics doesn't work. Bidenflation is getting worse and worse and worse. Well, right now, there is a way to get up to $5,000 in free silver on a qualifying purchase when you visit protectwithposo.com. This is the way that we can fight back against the inflation, against the spending, against the Federal Reserve, everything that's being pushed by the Biden administration that's coming after you, that's coming after your family. You just head on over to protectwithposo.com today. You go there right now, and folks, up to $5,000 in free silver on a qualifying purchase. Again, that's protectwithposo.com. Mike Davis, we were chatting about this on the back end there, and this is what I went and pulled the photos. Okay, they were loading those boxes into that truck from the White House on January 14th. We got it in Newsweek. This was obviously done in public. Let's show the photos, guys. There they are. And so if it just follows, right? This is a common sense argument. It follows that if they're loading the boxes on the 14th, that the designation would have happened prior to the 14th, the designation of the documents, where they're supposed to go, which documents go where, et cetera, et cetera. And so why do they keep sidestepping this situation where they say, oh, who was president in 2021 to now? I said, well, that's not the point. The salient point is who was president when it came down. Also, which I found kind of amusing. Andy McCarthy has argued for years that presidents cannot be prosecuted for obstruction while carrying out their constitutional duties, which I just thought was hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, Jack, you didn't see the Trump derangement exception to the commander-in-chief clause in the Constitution?
Yes, that's right. They stuck it in there.
The president can declassify anything he wants for any reason he wants in any manner he wants, except for Trump. You didn't see the Trump derangement exception in the Presidential Records Act, that presidents can take their presidential records when they leave office. And you didn't see the Trump derangement exception in the Espionage Act, that the president can't be charged with espionage unless you're Trump.
Right. So that's exactly it. Because when you look at any of these situations, even when they claim, by the way, the Espionage Act is a great example. So this was one of the other arguments they were making, saying, oh, well, it's the retention of the documents. It doesn't matter if they're classified or not. It's the retention of NDI, the retention of it. Well, okay, these are not originals. These are not original documents that he took from the White House or the government and is squirreling away in his home, because the Espionage Act was written during World War I. The systems were a little bit different back then because you actually had things like original documents versus copies. Nowadays, that's not how it works. And I can say that this part I know because I can talk about it from, my Intel hat. Obviously, I can't talk about specific systems, but the idea that the president of the United States is going to be given an original document and not a printout for a briefing, and that the government loses their access to the original document, that's just silly. It's obviously sitting on U.S. government-held computers. This isn't some document that they were prevented from getting because he had it down at Mar-a-Lago. That's just not the case.
And how can you unlawfully retain a record he's allowed to have under the Presidential Records Act? That's the problem with their whole theory. They're trying to say, again, that classified agency records sent to the president to advise him are not presidential records. That is just completely wrong. I promise you that's wrong. There is case law that that's wrong, but they want to ignore that. The agency records that are not subject to the Presidential Records Act are agency records, original agency records that are subject to FOIA, right? The Freedom of Information Act. Classified agency records are exempt from FOIA. And like you said, Jack, these are copies. These are not original. Maybe other than the love letter from the North Korean dictator to Trump. Maybe Trump kept his love letter. He said it's personal under the Presidential Records Act, and it's mine. I'm keeping Kim Jong, whatever the hell his name is, his love letter. Great, whatever. Yeah, there you go. I mean, but even then, it would be hard to argue that that's not a personal record. It's a love letter. Of course, it's personal. So it's just this argument is BS. And remember, there's no criminal component to the Presidential Records Act. The disputes are resolved through negotiations and civil lawsuits, not illegal home raids and espionage indictments. Look, Mike, you're going to be proud of me because I actually went last night and I was digging up the statutes. I was looking at them, not just the Presidential Records Act, but even went into the former
President's Act, the FPA, which is sort of a follow-on to all of this, and then where it delineates how the records are supposed to be used. And, Mike, here's the thing. These acts, they don't have any timeline on them. There's no, it doesn't say anything about he ceases being the former president 7 months after, or 8 months after, and then all of it has to be returned to the. It's just not in there. It's very ambiguous, and it specifically speaks to the idea that obviously presidents and former presidents are busy people, and you hear President Trump actually referring to this in that interview that he did with Brett Baer. He said, we didn't have time to go through it yet, and it seemed to me that the language he was using in that interview was very similar to the actual language of the statute itself. And I wondered perhaps if that was the legal advice that he was given, because they're looking at the statute and saying, Mr. President, this is how it works.
And that is how it works. I worked in the Bush 43 White House. I learned the Presidential Records Act inside and out during Kavanaugh's confirmation, because he was the White House staff secretary, and we had to go through millions of pages of records from the Bush 43 White House, and we had to navigate the Presidential Records Act to do it. President Trump is absolutely right as a matter of law. They all know this, right? Why don't they walk down at the Biden Justice Department? Why don't they walk down the hall to the Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, and get an opinion before they had Jay Bratt, this partisan operative, go to this biased judge, magistrate judge, Bruce Reinhart, to get this unnecessary, unlawful, unprecedented home raid? Why did they not even cite the Presidential Records Act when they did this? Because they know they are wrong. Again, we've been saying this from August, Jack. The whole point of this raid was to get Trump's declassified Crossfire hurricane records. He was getting ready to go into a civil lawsuit versus Hillary Clinton on the Russian collusion hoax on Crossfire Hurricane. He had these declassified records via presidential memo the day before he left office. These are so damning for Obama, Biden, Hillary, the FBI, the AG, the CIA. A lot of people in the federal government would have been destroyed if these records became public in that civil litigation. That's what this raid is all about. Everything else is complete BS. And if they actually cared about our national security and espionage, why do they not care about Biden's 5 sets of stolen classified records, moved several times, accessible by their Chinese agent, and almost certainly used by Hunter as the bagman for the Bidens to secure millions and millions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in corrupt Chinese, Ukrainian, Romanian, and other foreign corruption and bribery?
Well, that's exactly right. And they ditched that over to an IRS investigation. There's no CI investigation that's opened. There's no FARA investigation open. None of it. They're not looking into the bribery, any public corruption investigation. None whatsoever. No national security investigation. But I want to ask you about that as well, because, I heard as well through my own sources at the time that this was all about Crossfire Hurricane, and that's something that's now been completely reported. We were certainly one of the first here at Human Events. Obviously, you were also one of the first on this at War Room and everywhere else at Article 3 that you've been putting this out. Those Crossfire Hurricane documents, though, as far as we know, have not actually been recovered in any of these raids. Do we know that? Do we have any clarity on it?
Well, maybe they just grabbed the documents and they didn't put them in the inventory when they grabbed the documents. That could be, because remember, back, I think it was like August 18th of 2022, Bill Arkin, I think it was, at Newsweek, reported a leak from the Biden Justice Department that was the intent of the raid, was to get back the Crossfire Hurricane documents. Where are they?
Right, and so this becomes an interesting question, because if you notice that was all the rage when this thing first happened. Everybody was talking about it. It made it to Newsweek. Then suddenly we start hearing about nuclear facilities. There's this talk about Iran. Then, of course, the Iran map is essentially mentioned in the Jack Smith indictment. It's page 1. But if you dig through, CBS is reporting out now that they never recovered any Iran memo, and it is not one of the 31 counts of retention of NDI that he's even being charged with. So this whole thing about the tape and Trump was waving the documents back and forth, it seems like it's becoming more likely that what he was actually holding was a copy of the New Yorker from that week, where General Milley had leaked information. And when he's talking about leaking and highly classified and secret, he's just referring to what Milley had done a few days prior, or 5 days prior, in the pages of the New Yorker.
That's exactly right. Remember, Jack Smith is the Democrat prosecutor that Democrat attorneys general bring in to take out Republican presidential candidates, like Jack Smith did for potential Republican presidential candidate Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell back in 2012. Jack Smith brought a bogus corruption charge against him, took him out as a presidential candidate. The Supreme Court later in 2000, I think it was 15, ruled unanimously 8-0. It would have been 9-0, but Justice Scalia died. It must have been 2016. It was 8-0 that Jack Smith's legal theory was completely bogus. It is hard to get overturned by the Supreme Court on a criminal conviction. It is nearly impossible to do it unanimously. Jack Smith found the way, but guess what? He doesn't care. Jack Smith is a political Scud missile to take out Republican presidential candidates because the damage was already done, mission accomplished. Who cares if the Supreme Court reverses? Same thing here with
Mike Davis, Jack Smith, Mike Davis, and also I'm Jack as well. Thank you so much for joining us here, Human Events. We're just out of time for this segment. Where can people go to follow you, get your analysis? I mean, you're everywhere these days, man. I remember when you first started coming on War Room, but now it's like every time I turn around, you're cutting another promo. It's amazing. Congrats.
I'm like Chuck Schumer, man. I'm everywhere. So it's article3project.org. Article number 3project.org, at Article 3 Project on Getter Twitter Truth, and at MRDDMIA is my personal. And thank you, Jack.
The hardest working man in the legal biz. He's out of D.C. He's in Denver right now, but he's got that D.C. stink on him. He knows how this system works.